All right, folks, I am totally excited. One of my personal heroes is with me today, and he made time to talk with a complete stranger from the Deep South, so I appreciate it. His name's Dwayne Booth, a.k.a. Mr. Fish. He's probably, in my opinion, one of the most provocative, courageous, and dangerous political artists living today. He's also does some writing. He's a contributor to the Sheer Post. He is a political kind of commentator as well, I would argue. He's published in kind of most liberal media outlets like Slate and Vanity Fair, Mother Jones, and others in the past. I'll put his website down in the description. It's www.clowncrack.com, so you can see his work. I like Dwayne's work because at times it shocks me and it provokes me to think, and it makes me incredibly uncomfortable. And I think that is what good art does, as does philosophy and other things. He's penned a number of books. Go Fish: How to Win Contempt and Influence Folks When the World Blew Up. He wrote a kind of a textbook, I guess, right?
Yep.
Warning Graphic Content, which is a really kind of great, somewhat anthology of the history of political art and political cartooning and so forth, and the importance and social role it plays. He's written a couple of others I haven't got a chance to read yet. And I think your latest is Nobody Left, right? Yep. He also has a documentary out about him called Cartooning from the Deep End. I strongly encourage you to watch that, and we'll put a link in the description below as well. So, man, thank you again. I can't remember when I ran across your stuff, but I loved it. And like I said, it regularly shocks me and makes me uncomfortable and makes me think. So thank you for making time today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think we might have you might have a weird connection to this place. When I was watching your interview, I guess with Chris Hedges, there was a poster of Bill Hicks, I think. Well, Bill Hicks used to live here in this place called Valdosta, Georgia. So I thought that was an interesting thing. And he and Carlin and other folks, and I don't know, I'd love to hear about your kind of radicalization in some ways, or your critical process. But the thing I loved about Hicks is that he said all the things those of us who lived here were afraid to say, you know, and did that fearlessly, unapologetically. And the other thing I just wanted to bring up before I shut up and let you say something, I heard the story of your mom's sick note, and I thought that was just beautiful. So I hope that you'll allude to that. But how did this kind of all start for you? Were you always kind of artistically driven, et cetera?
Yes. Yeah. It's just like many people that I've spoken to who are in a similar kind of work. It starts in the family. It's not really an intellectual decision, as far as I can tell. I think just the atmosphere of my family as being one that was very interested in making the most inappropriate joke ahead of anybody else in the family turned us all into sort of, I guess, keen observers of the outside world, only in pursuit of the punchline. So you develop this reflex of not trusting the validity of authority, of just the fabric of society is not really set in any kind of permanence, because that's what jokes do. Jokes, they attempt, in order for a joke to function for anybody, you have to take a step back and think outside the box, because it really is a radical concept. You have to consider alternatives when you're listening to a setup for a joke. Otherwise, you're not going to think it's funny, because you're going to be told the punchline and it's not going to make logical sense. And you're going to say, well, that doesn't make sense. Yeah. So developing that habit of second guessing everything and essentially considering everything a three-dimensional object that you're able to walk around psychically had me very early on asking questions about, the place of even authority inside the family. There was no reason in my family to say, okay, I will honor the father in the family. the father has to be a nice person, and the father has got to behave like a sane human being and function with some degree of rationality to get respect.
Right.
So it really just started there. And obviously, when you get older and you start to extend your understanding of substructures and how these things are arbitrarily assembled and how hierarchies are there just because everybody is pretending they have justification, not because they have innate justification, you start to look at the world and you start to say, wait a minute, why should I be respecting politicians who have power, priests who have power, police who have power? These are just human beings who are functioning in roles. Now, are the roles, should they exist in a society? And so very early on, just a curiosity and a suspicion about how things hold together, yes, and if they should continue.
So you're kind of growing up in that family culture. Did that translate graphically from the get-go for you? Like, were you always the kid drawing, taking the art classes?
And I was not, I wasn't taking art classes, but I was always drawing. And that's one of the things that is featured in the documentary. There's a scene where I talk about, I'm going through the house that I grew up in, and I'm finding some pieces of art that I used to do when I was younger.
It's been a while since I saw it, so I'm sorry I forgot.
Yeah, and so I'm looking at these and I'm talking to the filmmaker behind the camera. And it all of a sudden occurred to me in the moment that my parents or nobody in my family ever said that the artwork that I did was good. But it's not because they were, jealous or wanted to teach me a lesson or anything like that. Just true to the mechanism that I was just describing about taking things sort of at face value and true to themselves, letting them demonstrate and prove themselves. Because I was able to draw, it was just seen as just like, oh, look, Dwayne finds some peace and the ability to explore certain things through drawing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to turn that into something like wow, like that's a magic trick that you're doing. They completely normalized it for me. So I think that one of the blocks for lots of people growing up when it comes to art, they're beaten over the head with this concept that it begins with craft. And if you can wow somebody with the craft, then you can be an artist that then can start to say things. I came at it a different way. It was about saying things, then utilizing different crafts to communicate the messaging that you're rendering. And so if my parents weren't saying, wow, how do you do that? It was just normal. There were no blocks. I had no internal thing that said, wow, I must be doing something very hard, and then developing certain anxieties about comparing myself to other artists' ability to do what I want to do. It wasn't like that. It just became a megaphone that I really loved speaking through.
Yeah. Well, I think that's huge because art really saved me in school. It's where I hid out. I wasn't a jock. My art teacher talked me out of quitting high school. And at the same time, like, especially like representative art, right? It always felt like there was a pass fail component to it, right? Yeah. And there's always this heavy judgment versus it being something that was way more organic. When I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you about the work you do now, it's hard to kind of pigeonhole your style, right? Because you will do almost hyper realistic work, but then kind of very rudimentary cartoons, right? Yeah. And is that a part of kind of just your aesthetic and philosophical approach?
Yeah, because it serves you want to serve your art. And so you want to serve the best vehicle with which to communicate your ideas. So, for example, I tend to use the hyperrealism for very serious subject matters. Because if I'm going to be talking about villainy on a sort of a national level, or trying to explain why the foreign policy of this country is reprehensible, you don't want to minimize the importance of that message by just doing a line drawing. Sometimes that functions in a way. But what I like to do is, if I'm talking about somebody who's been blown to pieces in a way that is disgusting and unjustified, I'm going to take 6 hours to draw what that really looks like, because it's the onus is on me as a communicator to be as truthful as I can. So I want to produce material that reflects the reality as precisely as possible, because people really need to see what that looks like. Because in order to have grown-up conversations, we need to know the depth of seriousness with which we should be engaging with these subjects. One of my favorite stories, the painter Goya, he did a series called the Disasters of War series at the end of his life. And it was during the Peninsular War, and he was rendering what he was seeing in the countryside, which was Napoleon's forces mutilating captured soldiers and even some civilians, and beheading them, cutting off their genitals, hanging them from trees, to say, listen, we are so brutal, there is no sense in fighting us. Best to retreat, back off. We've conquered you. With these etchings that Goya did, he thought that he was insane, because he could not he could not connect the former responsibility of an artist, which was to sort of capture maybe the glory of war, right, the rules of war as something that is normalized, and then see this version that is just this brutality that is so monstrous that you can't wrap your head around it. So when he finished these, I think there's about 85 pieces that he did, he hid them. He said, these should never be seen by anybody, because essentially they won't make sense and I'll just look crazy, and I think I might be crazy. Where the truth is that what he was doing as an artist was capturing the truth of war, even though the public wouldn't have any idea on how to process it. And certainly the authorities would not necessarily, they would not want it to be seen like that, because it's very hard to recruit and to justify war when you see what it really is. So that to me is like a really terrific early example of an artist elbowing decorum out of the way to get to the truth that everybody should recognize and that everybody should know. So I try to continue that tradition of just like, all right, if you want to see what true obscenity looks like, if we want to talk about mass violence and other things like that, I'm going to demonstrate that as starkly as possible, because it's important to do that.
Well, I think the other thing is the observer has to weigh the fact that the artist did that went there. Do you know what I mean? It brings you into the interaction instead of just the person in the actual image, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, one thing too, and this is one of the key things that I always like to talk about. The fact that those images, while they can seem obscene and gruesome and bombastic in a way that may shut down conversations, you're still literally depicting reality. You're seeing it, you're showing it as its own proof of existence. So people on some level are going to be able to resonate with it. Okay. So I think that the technique that an artist typically uses to enable he or she to engage in this kind of work is there's a difference between your private self and your public self. And as an artist, usually you are engaging with your subject and the materials and the pursuit of what you're trying to depict in a private space. Now, when you're in a private space, all of the cues that you get in public that usually say it's inappropriate to use this kind of language, it's inappropriate to distrust the king, question the king, question authority, all of those things, that when you're in your private space, you're not being influenced by that. So as an artist, if you want to engage with the subject, all you have is your relationship to the truth. So you're going to just work on that and be like, okay, because bullshit doesn't have a place to exist in these private moments, because it'll feel like bullshit. And you don't want to do that. You want to engage truthfully. So artists tend to go deep, become more, they contemplate things a little more deeply and try to be truthful, so that when they present these things to the public, that's when it's usually perceived in public So people have the decorum things and this idea that you need to be polite, that's inappropriate, but at the same time, it's still communicating a truth that may connect to the viewer's own experience in their private deliberations on things. And why it will make sense. Just for an example, for many decades, it would be inappropriate to go into the public square and say that women were equal to men, right? Or that Black people were not savages. But in private, if you engage even at the absolute height of misogynistic, sort of chauvinistic societies, anybody who has a mother, a sister, and engages privately knows the abilities and gifts and the non inequality that really exists. But when you take it into the public, where there's penalties for not following these prejudices and these discriminatory practices, you're going to just have it. You're going to literally become a different person. So I always see like the job of the artist of just like, what does this really feel like? What is the real truth about this?
Yeah. Well, I think you also, because we started off kind of a little bit talking about comedy, right, and punchlines, right? But your art, not only in terms of stylistically, but some stuff is very lighthearted, right, commentary, and then some of it's not funny at all.
Right.
I mean, so there is that kind of spectrum. At what point and maybe you answer this, Dwayne, so just bear with me. When did you think that you could actually do this for a living, and when did it become more deliberate in terms of creating stuff and putting it out in public? Because when I first saw your stuff, it reminded me of running across Adbusters in the early 90s.
Yeah.
Right. And that was something that, in terms of brandalism, right, and playing with pop culture images and consumer culture. I mean, so what was the transformation like, and when did you decide, hey, I'm going to do this for a living, or try to?
It was never, I never had any consideration of how to sustain a livelihood that would give me cold, hard cash. And that's all through the documentary. That's sort of the underpinning through the entire documentary. It's always just been a place that I've been most comfortable in, and it's the form of language that I find most precise to engage with. So it was actually a matter of taking a series of crappy jobs and saving enough money to then take off a series of months before I got another crappy job. And so in a way, I fell into it accidentally. In fact, the whole process of becoming a political cartoonist was absolutely accidental. I think the story is in the Go Fish book, although I'm not 100% sure. But when I had dropped out of college, my mission was to become a dangerous philosophical writer and writer of existential plays, and being
another Camus.
Yeah. I was reading a lot of Camus then. And so what ended up happening was that I lived in the back of my parents' house and would stay up all night and work by candlelight with a portable typewriter.
That's very romantic, right?
Yeah. Although, can you imagine a more annoying 19-year-old? Right. And so what I ended up doing was I would sit and I would just work on these ideas, just figuring out theories of everything. And in the process, if you're trying to write plays, you're trying to write scenes, levity jokes are going to be in there, right? And I've always been very, as I said earlier, with my family, it's always been a mission to try to be funny. I found it very easy to draw the joke quicker than figuring out how to render it in type to get all the words exactly right. So what I would do is I'd be working, and if there was a joke, I had a stack of typing paper, and I would take the paper and I would draw the joke and set it down and be like, okay, and then put a mark in the writing that I was doing, okay, joke, insert. And then later on, I'd be like, all right, so how do I word this and make this function inside of the thing that I'm writing? So after a time, I ended up with this stack of cartoons. Never wanted to be a cartoonist. I was never like, this is what I want to be. And so some of them were, commentary on culture and politics, just because that was sort of the work that I was writing about. And since I was a dropout, I decided, maybe I should look like I'm bringing in some money into the house to justify me just living and taking from my parents. So I mailed the stack off to some magazines that I knew, and these were magazines that just don't exist anymore. Remember, this was the 1980s and early 90s, when there was still some semblance of an alternative press in this country. So there's Z Magazine. There's, I guess, in these times still exists. Mother Jones was a force to be reckoned with. There was a magazine called Anarchy Magazine that published a ton of Noam Chomsky. So I sent it off to these people, and Anarchy Magazine actually was the first cartoon that I ever sold, although they didn't pay me except with copies of the magazine. But it elevated the whole interest of just like, oh, wow, now I have like an audience outside of my family and my circle of friends. And I started to get letters. In fact, the first, one of the publications that I can't remember what it was called, but the editor wrote back to me. Now, this is before emails and so forth. So these are notes, these are letters. The editor wrote back to me and he said, Mr. Fish, I'm so glad that I finally got a stack of your cartoons. I've been following your work for 30 years and I'm a big fan. I was 19 at the time. So I couldn't, and the Mr. Fish moniker was something that was just going to be temporary. I just didn't feel like, putting my own name on it, because when you're 19, you just want to be creative and strange. But when I got that letter saying that I'd had a fan that predates my actual existence, I'm like, all right, I guess I'm Mr. Fish. I'm the old wise Mr. Fish at 19.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I should tell folks that aren't familiar with your work is another thing I love about it. It's critical of the political spectrum in some ways. Like, I think you're an equal opportunity commentator. And I guess does that, and I'm sure you're aware of like Matt Taibbi's work. I mean, Chris Hedges has talked about this kind of polarization in the media, which are basically kind of propaganda outlets at this point. But I imagine that marketability, right? You can't offend the sensibilities of liberal folk who might, and this was discussed some in the documentary. I remember that, but
yeah. There's certainly been some issues, and one of the reasons, and I'll address that specifically in a second, but one of the reasons that I wrote the most recent book, which is this one I happen to have right here, the Nobody Left book, is this examination of what made it possible in the late 1950s and through the 60s and into the early 70s to mobilize such an effective movement against
variety of things, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's just there's a variety of things, but what is so true about why that works so well, and historically, I mean, it's also runs through the 1800s in France and in many other places. The technique that I think everybody should ascribe to, because it's the most accurate way to, I think, consider criticism of hierarchies in state, is to not try to reside with either the right or the left in your proclamations of what is wrong with the world. It really comes down to what Kurt Vonnegut would call the winners versus the losers. There's a winner state, right? There's this moneyed power state that resides above all of the other subsections of a hierarchy. And so the onus is on us to recognize that is the fact and not look for camaraderie with one side of the power structure in contempt of the other.
Right.
And in fact, when I started to do political cartoons, I was looking at Mother Jones, and I was looking at these criticisms of what was then the Reagan administration. And it was extremely frustrating because I was just like, these aren't the arguments. You don't argue against the, you don't vilify the right by imagining the left has all of the virtue. It's just disingenuous and it's just not accurate.
Real binary too, right?
Yeah. And so it doesn't reflect real life.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the things that I interview in the most recent book. I interview actual people who were part of that movement in the 1960s, and I asked them about how does that translate to in today's terms, and what can we do? Is there nobody left anymore? Is there progressivism inside this country anymore? Is it even possible? And
can we talk about that at some point, please?
Yeah, totally.
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, but I can talk about it just by saying that it becomes more and more problematic for a number of reasons that maybe we'll touch on as we keep talking. But I think that as far as outlets of progressive voices, they've been diminished to the point of not having true access, except in curated spaces, which is what we say is wrong with the right. Far right. And even the extreme left. No, I wouldn't say the extreme left. I would say the corporatized Democratic Party. Right.
Well, can you tell folks what you mean by a curated space? Just we might need to translate that a little bit. Yeah, sure. It's with how information is shared and disseminated these days are through this new technology that we all engage with every single day. Now, there's algorithms inside of these technologies that recognize what your curiosities are, what stories you're following through with, and how you're building your knowledge of politics in the world. And of course, we tend to want to have our pre-existing opinions reinforced by what's going on outside the window. So then you start to develop you build these algorithms to where, for example, if I went to my Google News right now, and somebody else who's of a different political persuasion our pages would look completely different. Yeah. But the understanding is that when you go, for people who engage with that platform, they think that they're just getting the objective news. Right. It's just like, wow, but it's really feeding their rage. And also the way this information is composed in modern technology is that it has to be shorter. What it's doing is just trying to really get a reaction out of you, much more than a comprehension or a deeper dive into historical examples, or just what are we even talking about? Context, whatever. Yeah, all the context and all that. So you end up with these news streams that are surface, they're very staccato. And if you can't have any time to deliberate or contemplate things, you can only get dumber and dumber. In fact, I mean, it's one of the things that's really interesting about my teaching. I teach at Penn, and I teach a course on the history of satire, and I teach a course on the history of art as commentary. So it's not just about political cartooning, it's about fine art, and it's just about the artistic voice. And engaging with younger generations. And I was even telling them last night, I taught last night, I've gotten into the habit of asking them questions of, do you know who this is? What do you know who Chelsea Manning is? We were talking about whistleblowers last night. And they just don't know. They have not heard of Abu Ghraib. Right. Like all of these things that are pretty recent history, that are extremely telling and revealing about what is desperately wrong with the world right now, and should engender a certain degree of panic from an engaged and educated population. It's just not happening. Yeah. So where are they going to go to get that? That's the question. Where at one time there was the alternative press, there was the arts community that was actually, you had access to it. Remember that the alternative press was displayed with conventional news sources and mainstream news sources at newsstands. Yeah.
And there was a morning edition and there was an evening edition, right? So these things are churning constantly. So you would get off of your bus or your train or something, and you would go and you would grab newspapers. They were all there.
In urban America, right?
Right. Well, there are some, if you live, I guess that there are, I guess the rural examples might best be exemplified by the presence of university and colleges in these places, because many of the universities and colleges had their own national versions of the alternative press, of independent journalism. And so that was one of the key things, because one of the things that we have to remember too, you just made me think of this, is that remember how is our news financed now? If you consider 25 years ago, where there were any number of corporations, we'll call, or organizations that participated in the dissemination of information, that now in the United States, there's 5, right? And so there's these mega corporations that are controlling just the access of all information, not just news, it's everything. And so what does that mean? That means that if you want to participate as somebody who wants to share information, one of the number one things you're not going to be able to do on those platforms is produce any information that questions the viability and the strength and the power of a corporation. Because why would they do that? Why would they allow that to happen? If you're a corporation, the last thing you're going to do is be like, hey, this is a great argument to why we should all say F you to corporations. Let's get this out there.
Yeah, there's little discussion about kind of the default censorship built into all this, right? I mean, whether it's corporate news or all of it, even what we see online now. But can we dive off a little bit into, like, because I've never heard you articulate really your political analysis, but it is kind of anarchist in a way, I guess, because you're critical of hierarchy, right? And I have a friend that works for a.k.a. Press and other folks, and I don't want to nail you down on that, but the struggle I'm having is I do think, I haven't read Nobody's Left yet. I'm curious as to what you concluded from that, and I've just been operating for a couple of decades now with the assumption that we're not a nation of citizens, we're a nation of consumers, and that goes back to kind of Edward Bernays, right? Propaganda, public relations, the power, the melding of mass advertising as well as political advertising, and those tools spilling over into one another, right? And we're both in our 50s, so I'm old enough to remember the 60s, and you can really see this now if you watch old episodes of Saturday Night Live in the 70s. Like, it was just a different fucking time, man.
Yeah.
Like, right. And I just say that because I wonder, number one, I've been critical of whether traditional movements can work anymore in the age of the selfie, in the age of hyper individualism, in the age of citizen. When I've taught, like, and this happened recently, I guess, lectured in a communications class, and I asked 30 students, like, who's the mayor of your town? And nobody can, and I'm not sure we've had engaged citizens for some time, right? Or whether and I see this in the South especially, we don't want critically thinking citizens. We don't want informed citizens, right? And I don't know what all that means, but I thought about it a lot when I've seen some of what you've had to say about Nobody's Left and some of the people you included in that edited volume. But where are you at with all of that? I mean,
well, I will. It's funny because I would agree. I mean, I don't like labels on anything.
Yeah.
But I will say, I mean, in the original definition of what anarchism was, I would certainly say yes. I mean, that's something that I see a great deal of validity. And for those who don't know exactly what that is, the whole idea for an anarchist society is that your trajectory through life is going to be determined by your own internal passions, gifts, and desires. with the idea being that as a organism, a group organism, these things are sort of hard-boiled into us because we all want to survive, and we also want our families to survive, meaning that the instinct when it comes to, say, gathering food or something, the instinct that seems to be innate in us is not to feed ourselves first, but to make sure that our children are fed first. We will go without in order to help perpetuate the continuation of the group. Right. So that's like an anarchist principle. Now, what can happen, what starts to happen, that can only function if you have your comprehension of the group is personal enough, and you understand the parameters of what that group is. The fact that we have reproduced to the extent that there is this overpopulation of our organism, our species, in order to understand further and further bands out from what we can cognitively understand in our orbit, you have to then create these abstractions in order to envelop and name all of this multitude that is impossible for our consciousnesses to really fully comprehend.
And physiologically, we might not be wired to even take that in. You know what I mean? Neurologically.
Exactly. Yeah. So then you have to develop these strategies for doing that. So it's just like, okay, my family, I'll just say, okay, my family, all the people who have the same color skin as me, that is a family now that is going to be precious and meaningful to me. Or you need to become more arbitrary with sort of political ideologies,
religious
all of those things. Yeah. And so what ultimately starts to happen, then we have to have the question of whether or not this is a problem of human consciousness. Just like you were saying, are we even capable of that? Because what happens is I give this equation to my students to ponder, where I actually hand out a penny to all the students at the beginning of the class. And so they have a penny. I say, okay, take your pennies. And I'm like, so everybody gets their pennies. And I say, okay, now what you have in your hand is a penny. It's its own proof. It's physically manifested in your hand. It's irrefutable. You know what that is. It is also a cent, right? So it's got this imaginary value that we've attached to it.
Right.
Now, human consciousness, this is where the switch comes in, is that human consciousness, in order to understand and turn this into currency that then has applicability inside the society that we live in, we have to equate a penny and a cent as being the exact same thing. So that when I show you a penny, you think you're seeing a cent. You think you're seeing a value, right, and all of the things that are attached to a currency. So what does that mean? That means we have the ability with our consciousness to bring three-dimensionality to our imaginations. And we do it constantly with other things. Say, for example, just the American flag, right? All of these things, all of a sudden it becomes something much grander than it actually physically is. It doesn't become something that represents something. It becomes the thing itself. And then we do that with people. We do that with, for example, when Donald Trump became president, all of a sudden he became the president of the United States. You have to respect the office. So then then you can't criticize as freely because then you're disrespecting the office. Right. So what happens is you hobble the ability to, all of a sudden you're limited with your language. If you're limited with your language, you're going to be limited with your ability to comprehend things. Right. So I think that that's something that really has to be considered is, are we as beings with this consciousness, is human consciousness actually a fallibility that actually is going to justify and result in the fact of our ultimate demise? We haven't been here that long.
It's a great question.
Yeah. And I think it's a really important one, because absolutely. I'll say one more thing just to add on top of that is that once you enter into then like political or cultural conversations. And this is why I say that we cannot allow just the people in power to frame the conversations for us, because then it's going to become a political conversation, and it's not the right starting place. So for example, if we consider how we comprehend different value systems, right? You have currency and money. That's an accumulative value system, which means the less you have, the less valuable it is, the more valuable. So I would say it goes like this: is a cumulative value system. If you consider human beings and you consider human life, that's an intrinsic value system. It just is. It simply is. It just, I want to say it bees, but I don't know if that's the right way to say it. It simply is. So it's an intrinsic value system. So it runs this way. So if you have these two things all of a sudden facing each other, there is a conflict, because then you're always going to have a scenario where the cumulative value system of capital is always going to be able to be argued to supersede the intrinsic value of human life. And you see it all the time. It's all the justification for how big business functions, like quite literally.
Right.
You know, there's a quote from Kurt Vonnegut that I absolutely love, which is, we could have saved ourselves, but we were too damn cheap.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things in there. And this also makes me think of existentialism, in the sense of the question of whether humans want to be free. Mm-hmm. Right, is a big one that I grapple with all the time. But those, it sounds like you're also a constructionist, because you know, you're recognizing that these systems only work, whether it's a currency system or whatever else, because there's a collective agreement. I don't do a pennies thing. I used to go into classes with I would photocopy a $5 bill, and then I'd ask a student to give me one, and we would hold them up and have a whole discussion of which one's real. Right. Right. And they're both real, right? Yeah. Empirically, via our sense, and both are material, right? But then we would dive off into not only, and then I would give the counterfeit one back to the student, and we would have this whole exchange of that it's not real, but then also talk about how the state defines what's real, because if you go to the store and buy a pack of cigarettes with a $5 counterfeit, you're going to jail, right? So there's a structural reinforcement of what's real and what's not, you know, and you're also kind of teetering on a conversation about hegemony, right? And that rebellious act of us realizing, look, all these folks are just playing roles in institutions, which is, I think, an anarchist kind of critique, right? That hierarchies get humans to be inhuman. I think this is Weber too, right? That we internalize our roles and statuses and then crush each other. This, I would also, and I'll shut the fuck up in a second, but kind of totalitarianism and Hannah Arendt and other folks, right? The dangers of just following orders, right? And being able to abdicate personal responsibility and also kind of turn off whatever's good in us, you know. And you talk about this a lot in other interviews you've done. You know, I think one of the things about the United States, to me, compared to other places, that we're not a culture that encourages self-reflection, right, and the pondering of whether we're all internally capable of great evil or great good, and that we have to grapple with that, and also grapple with the fact that that has to be extended to other people when we analyze why people do what they do. Does that make any sense?
No, it makes absolute sense. You know, it's because it's and really, if you think about it, what it one of the reasons why it's people don't want to consider it is because it ultimately leads to the need for a complete restructuring of reality.
Well, and I would say the self too, right? Like when I think of racial statuses or gender, and you play, and this is the other thing you do in your art a lot, I think you really play with gender and sexuality in a way that's, I wonder, is both personal and political, right? But you know, I live in a place where people are still fucking pissed off about the Civil War, right? Around a whole myth, and it's serious, dude. Like around a whole mythology that is verifiably easy to prove wrong with the historical documents, right? But there's this part of me that feels like, you know, for white folks, for men, for whoever's in a dominant status, right, there's an existential hole or vacuum, right, if we value ourselves on something other than this facade that's socially created, right? So to ask, you know, poor white Confederate you know, hobbyist to reanalyze that is literally an existential threat,
right?
You know, or masculinity with men. We can go down a list of things, right? And that's a project I don't find most people very interested in. And let me put it a different way. folks of color in the Deep South love me, specifically men of color, when we're doing anti-racist work, right? But
Yeah.
when the sexism manifests in that work and we try to talk about it, that's, that, or the capitalism or the military, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And that's one of the and that's one of the things that I think, that's one of the reasons why I think the arts community needs to be leading the charge on these kinds of alterations to society, because what they have done is that they allow these kinds of conversations to happen in an organic way. Like a lot of like the feminization of society is going to come from men being honest about what their fears are and what their and how they are actually questioning of the viability of the brutality of misogyny as a solution to anything. Right. And so the way you do that is you have to sneak it into the culture through art, and you have to make it funny, beautiful, all of these things that will make somebody want to revisit it, and not just make it about like an argument for something.
Right.
And that's why the strength of the 1960s, I think, was evident because of that. It wasn't the radicalism of the 1960s was not being supported by the dominant culture at all. It was just about these personal explorations. It's just like, wait a minute, we just went through a history where we almost annihilated everybody on the planet. And that was led by the tactic for that, and the strategy came out of a version of follow the leader, right? And trusting your elders to have your best interests at heart. It almost destroyed the world. So obviously, when you come out as a generation from a situation like that, you're going to want to start from square one. And when you do that, it does become a personal thing. What is my connection to the world? What is my group? What is my nation? What is my tribe? It's about like what makes sense to me. And celebrating that personal journey was a lot of what that was about. And when you do that, like we said at the early beginning of our conversation, it involves an allergy to bullshit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and maybe you said this somewhere. It seems to me, and I've said it, I think innovative protest is an art form. I think now it doesn't last, right? So in Greensboro, when folks sit down, right, we've begged, we've pleaded, but no, we're going to this kind of new innovative form, which catches the powers that be off guard, and they don't know how to respond to it, or it brings to the surface all the latent horseshit that's always there, and violence that's always there. And the idea that we want to create a different world or a different community, to me, seems wholly artistic too. And I'm kind of dense, again, keep in mind that I'm from the Deep South and bad schools, and but I never thought, when I was making art, I never thought about, and in fact, I stopped painting because I felt like, how can I paint when all this stuff is going on? Like, and wasn't ever in a program that made the connection between political statements and art and so forth. And it wasn't until later, but it seems to me that you're right, both. And I mean, would you say the same thing about comedy though, too? Like Bill Hicks was able to say things to us, or good literature or sci-fi,
it's a disruption. I mean, art is a disruption. And by creating that disruption, what are you going to do in that place of disruption? Because when you create the disruption, what that does to the viewer is it pulls him or her into the actual moment, right? And so if you bring yourself to a moment and you're testing the viability of whether it makes sense or not, you're working at full capacity, right? So it's important to have those disruptions. And what you bring up Bill Hicks, one of the things that people should remember about Bill Hicks is how difficult of a time he had in the United States versus when he went to England and went to other places, where people were just like, this guy is the greatest. He's a genius. And then he comes back and, just as he says, he's playing the comedy pouch and fucking it's like
the basement of someplace in Peoria.
And so there's a couple things to consider about that. One of the things when it comes to humor is people should recognize, if you have an understanding of the history of satire, the mission of satire, it's not always about looking for the laugh. I don't think jokes are, or humor really is. That can be the byproduct, you know. But the truth of the matter is you want to be disruptive, and if you want to have effective commentary as a comic, and Bill Hicks is a great example of this. There are great moments when you are laughing a great deal, but there's also real outrage inside of what he said. And so after you see a Bill Hicks show, you would leave with the great experience of having laughed, but you're also going to remain a little bit angry about injustice. And that's what's key. Because if you compare Bill Hicks to somebody like Jerry Seinfeld, they were contemporaries of each other, and you can see the trajectory. You know, Bill Hicks never got a show. He never got any access to that. And because what happens with contemporary versions of satire, and I would even say that The Daily Show was guilty of this. While I loved the Daily Show, I really thought that Jon Stewart did a lot of really great things, but he also did some things that I found quite reprehensible, which was when it went up to the line, he would become an apologist for himself and say, I'm nothing but a comedian. He would apologize for some statements that he made that were actually 100% accurate. Because at the end of the day, he is Viacom. He's not just Jon Stewart. And so the mission of satire in contemporary terms is make sure you leave them with more laughs than feelings of outrage, because then you can make your audience is going to have their physiology is going to be satiated by a feeling of relief through laughter, and you're not politicizing.
Well, and this is, I'm so glad you brought this up because I didn't want to forget it. I've been pissed and peeved and wonder, like the comedic part is so essential, but what I felt has happened specifically with Jon Stewart, now Trevor Noah, Stephen Colbert, we can go down the list with liberal comedy, right, which became the news source really for a lot of folks on, I don't want to call them the left because I don't really think they're not the left, liberal America, right, a liberal middle class Democrat America. I just felt like all of that in comedy got turned into catharsis, which might have stymied action, you know, and then political action with social media becomes pushing like, and I've done something, or sharing content somebody else made. But I mean, is that too critical? Because I still see it, and not only that, it certainly fueled polarization in its own way. And I would say this about Michael Moore. I remember seeing something, maybe Bowling for Columbine. I was in Decatur, Georgia, suburb of Atlanta, little within the perimeter, right? And people clapping at the end of the movie, and I was just like, this isn't going to change. You know what I mean? Like, do you think that's too harsh? But
no, I think it's an understanding of how these things can go, and you should definitely be very vocal about it for sure, because there has been this tradition when it has come to art, you know, very strong commentative art. For example, there was a sculptor who was very big in the 1980s and I guess into the 90s. His name was Dwayne Hanson. And he was one of the very first hyper-realistic sculptors, where he would create these scenes with people and make them look like it was so true to life that it was really spectacular to museum goers. And he did an exhibit that was homeless people. And so he made, if you remember the 1980s, that became a huge issue, particularly during the Reagan years, where there was this explosion of homelessness as a catastrophic situation that needed to be addressed.
Turning out of mental health hospitals and so on, right?
Exactly. So Dwayne Hanson did this exhibit where you saw these people who were really suffering. They were filthy and they were just laying on the gallery floor and stuff. And people were talking about how powerful it was an exhibit and just how enlightening it was and so forth. But guaranteed, it gave it all it does is it has people you go through and you're just like, wow, my heart is breaking for this fake human being. So that means I have a heart. Now I'm going to step out onto the streets of New York and I will not look at an actual human being who is suffering. So so that addresses exactly what you were saying. The only thing you can say about it that is positive is that if you have a line here and you say, okay, these are people who are on these are people who don't give a shit about anything. Here's the normal person. If these kinds of forms of communication move somebody on that line a little bit closer to actually becoming politicized and become active in the right kinds of ways that can engender participation in the democracy, outside of just voting for just the next power broker every 2 to 4 years, at least it is moving somebody, giving somebody a little bit of the language that is necessary to engender a much more powerful and meaningful movement. That's the only thing you can say about it. So while I agree with you, I wouldn't completely slam the desire to use that language. But I would certainly say that, yes, by not using it sufficiently and figuring out ways to connect it in towards the end game in the best sense of the word, then it does become a barrier and does become this placation of and will neuter the movement. And I think that that's largely what has happened.
Yeah. Well, given what, you doing Nobody Left, where are you at with, because it seems to me that we need movements probably as much, if not more, than any time in our history. And there are movements occurring. We saw what I would argue the preliminary exposure of January the 6th. I live in that world. Those folks are real. They're not going away.
Yeah.
Are you, I guess what I'm asking is, are you optimistic? Because I find myself in between the poles, between the alt-right and liberal folks, right? And I find both ends of the spectrum really being unwilling to be uncomfortable and be self-critical, right?
Yeah. And I do think that, and that's a very keen way to put it. And I think you're 100% right. But what that goes back to is what I was saying earlier, and sort of what the book is about, is that the only way I think to improve society in a meaningful way is actually to not use the usual forms of protest, or at least rely exclusively on the usual forms of protest. The only way to shift the society is, in a way, is almost to just ignore the usual tactics and almost ignoring politicians, ignoring the power brokers. Because what ends up happening is we end up starting to develop this mindset where we start to think that the only way to fix things is to get permission by the people who are actually imprisoning us. And it's just not going to happen.
Who we also fund.
Exactly. Yeah. So it becomes you can't possibly expect anything to really come out of that. Certainly not in a timely fashion, and certainly not in a way that is going to guarantee a situation where we have agency again as people inside of a participatory democracy.
Well, I guess the question I have is, have we ever had agency? Especially our generation. I keep asking folks, like, how does one detox or rehab or start a recovery program from capitalism, or white supremacy or patriarchy and, a system of misogyny, or, you know what I mean? It seems to me that, and I've spent some time in intentional communities like Buddhist monasteries and so forth, which are still connected to these systems in a variety of ways. But, it's been interesting to see that when humans come together that do want to be self-reflective, that do agree on some precepts on how we're going to behave and treat one another, it's an amazing damn thing, right?
Well, that's connected with what we've already been saying. I do think that the job then is therefore to sort of curate different kinds of meeting places, different kinds of ways to interact with each other. Like if you're arguing, like I tend to really despise, it was very hard during Trump's presidency to engage with serious conversation for a number of reasons. But one of the things—
Even there?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, it's in my own family, there's in my wife's family. It becomes like, I always like to argue and justify my value system and my morals based on humanitarian ideas, not like not using political justifications, or even like I hope I never need to use the name Trump to make a point in my favor. I don't want to, because
I would say also Biden
yeah,
or
exactly.
Obama
Oh,
or whoever
listen.
else, right? Yeah,
See, that's the thing that's happened with me in the past, where when George W. Bush was president, I was an absolute hero to many people. When Obama became president, I just continued my job, where it was just like, no, talk about the drone programs and all of this stuff.
Deportations, whatever.
Everything. And the fact that he just went from just like saying, yeah, I've thought about it, and I think that gay marriage is really, between a man and a woman. And then all of a sudden the finger is in the wind for the shit. And then he changes it, and people are just like, oh, okay, let's allow those kinds of people to sort of frame the arguments. And it's nonsense. So when I was criticizing Obama, while I was getting death threats from the right, when I was criticizing George W. Bush and the war on terror, I actually was literally getting death threats from people who were supporting Obama. Yeah. And, it's the same thing happening now. I actually did a recent cartoon last week about Biden. And, I post some stuff on Instagram, and I get people like, I agree with a lot of what you say, but you're way off on this, and it's just, again, it's people have got to be pulled out of this, just like you were saying, this.
What do you do with that comment? Like, because I get that a lot too. In fact, I had a 2-hour conversation with a white rural woman recently who called our organization, and I'll talk with anybody,
Yeah.
Like, I'm fallible. I'm just a human trying to find my way in this very complicated universe that I don't think we can really understand, right?
Yeah.
But that almost, it's not a trope, but like, it's predictable. Like, well, I kind of like what you're doing, but I just don't like the way you're going about doing it. Always coming from people who generally aren't in the fray.
Right.
I mean, how do you respond to those Instagram? I don't know if you do Twitter or whatever else, but
Twitter, I haven't made friends with. I can't quite figure it out. But
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, my history with that is always to engage.
Okay.
Always. And that was a thing that was in like 2005, when it was really impossible to have anything negative to say about American foreign policy or the administration, and even questioning the heroism of the troops.
Yeah.
That was also really, really, and I got a lot of people saying that I want to murder you.
Yeah.
And I would always engage with those people, and I never ever ended up with that person becoming angrier and staying and digging their heels in.
Yeah,
because to your point, if the longer you allow these conversations to go, like it becomes more and more obvious that it's two human beings talking.
Yeah.
So
well, if you can get people to talk, I mean, we got a little film on whiteness. We did a little film on kind of neo-Confederate hobby folks, Confederate culture in the South, and they're on YouTube. So I'll get the comments, and one of the reasons I created this thing is like, let's talk about it. Like, I will but what I find is that folks have a lot to say, and this goes back usually through an avatar, right? Of some sort, but there can be a whole string of pretty vile stuff and assumptions about who I am. And I'm sure you get this too, right? And I don't know if it's gotten worse in the past few years because of further polarization, but the way I stop all that now is just say, hey, I've got a podcast. Come on, man, let's talk.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. And that's what we have to do. Yeah. And that's one of the things with the work that I do too, that I like to sort of complicate people's interpretations of what I do is.
And who they think you are. Probably.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll have political commentary, but I'll also have a shit ton of like dick jokes and stuff.
Yeah.
So what that does is there are people who then just love the sheer jokes that I make. And so they know that I'm more than just somebody who's shilling for the left, or something like that. So then I have greater dimensionality to what I do. And so then we can have a different kind of conversation, because in some way they like me just as somebody who is funny.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if you because do you remember Androgynous Pat on SNL?
Yeah.
So if you don't fit into a camp, you're kind of politically androgynous, and people, at least my experience is like, it really does dumbfound folks with how to kind of engage.
I remember when I did a book, I think when I was touring around with Go Fish, I was at a book festival in Atlanta, and they gave me a big room. I had a few hundred people there, and I was talking about stuff and showing slides that were, critical of Obama and critical of Hillary Clinton and stuff like that. And afterwards, in the signing line, it was amazing. All of a sudden, I had these, these very conservative ex-Marines like, I want to shake your hand, and it felt a little strange because I knew that these are the people that are going to want to string me up by my neck
when they check your stuff out.
Yeah, when they go a little bit deeper, but it's true. It's people are always looking for some support for the team that they've decided to throw in with,
right?
And they really want their affiliation with this group to excuse them from having to think about anything.
Yeah,
it's just like.
I was a little trepidatious about talking with you because, like, just talking with you will be a sin here. In a way. You know what I mean? Because I'm a socialist. All this other stuff is what folks say anyway. But who is your audience these days? Who is that group of people?
I've been around long enough now to where I have a pretty good, solid group of people who are
supportive.
Yeah, and they're just concerned. I got a lot of young people too now that are finding me and communicating with me because it is really inspiring, I think, to have this generation communicating. It's disdain for anybody who is unwilling to recognize that there's a problem with climate.
Yeah.
And also just the gender issues. Look what's just the last 10 years alone. I mean, you must have had the same reaction to me as far as just like when the gay marriage question came up. That was just like, that happened so quickly and became by and large accepted by the nation quicker than I would never have predicted that. Yeah. And so I think that now moving into this thing where there's just the question of, what is gender? What is my, what are my tastes and appetites and affiliations? What does that mean? It's becoming much more fractured in a way that is wonderful, multiplicitous in a way that is just like, I couldn't predict that. So now you have, by and large, a power structure in this country that is largely white men in their 70s. And this new politicized younger generation that is coming up, right? So there is great hope. The only worry that I have is that, and this is something that I've talked to young people about, and they agree with me, is that they've gotten conditioned by the various technologies that we were talking about earlier to where impatience is built so hard into their DNA that the idea of longevity or having to sustain a certain level of discomfort as you turn the giant ship away from the iceberg can become disruptive to momentum. Even if you just look at the Occupy Wall Street movement from a few years ago, which Obama
kind of stepped on for the record.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And if you look at that, what was so inspiring about that is that came about by people basically saying, let's all congregate around the same level of pain at looking at the injustice of how capitalism is structured. Right. And if you remember, there were so many people asking, who is in charge here? What are your bullet points?
Yeah.
And there was this great deal of frustration
in terms of the media trying to figure out
who was how do we frame this narrative, right? Who are the heroes and villains in this?
Right.
And that's what was so beautiful about it, because it gave this snapshot of sort of what the 1960s was about, which was just like, no, we're now acknowledging each other's recognition of injustice, and we're all saying, this hurts and this is wrong. Right. That's the kind of political pressure that I like. But that said, what did it take to dismantle that movement? It took further sort of attempts to define it from culture to where people then started to say, all of a sudden occupiers started to have to use phrases like, well, I'm not against capitalism, I just want a fairer form of capitalism, right? So it starts to soften it that way.
Right, better
and then all you have to do, you go to Zuccotti Park in the middle of the night, you push down the library and steal people's sleeping bags. And all of a sudden it was just like, now what do we do? And that speaks to what you were saying earlier about the political, the activist class really is sort of a middle class white institution. And so they're not used to discomfort. They're used to saying, for example, it would be nice, it's in the middle of the summer, I think I'll watch, a Rankin and Bass animation about, Rudolph. Bam, I can watch it on my phone. And this is when I start to, this is when maybe you and I will start to sound like we're old men. But, at one time it was just like, you didn't have the ability to satiate every thought or every idea that crossed your mind.
Or desire.
To the point, you had to wait. I had to take a nap to watch Wizard of Oz when it was on every year, and I was afraid to blink because I don't want to miss anything. But now we have the ability, people think that, oh, wow, we're becoming so much smarter because we have access to Wikipedia. The internet can tell us anything we want. But we won't have to access it until we are asked the question that we don't know. So why try to develop a wisdom and a comprehension of how the world works when, if that question ever comes up, I'll just look it up on my phone.
Yeah, good. Any chance you saw WALL-E, the Pixar film?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I'm not a big Pixar fan, but I was amazed they made it.
Yeah.
Quite honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just one last thing, and thank you again for today. Like, I guess two things. Do you ever feel alienated in this process, or have you kind of grown past that? Because I felt I've grown past it in the sense of realizing that what's happening is a normal reaction most of the time to pushing in either direction, if that makes any sense. That it's my point is that I think for a long time, for me, the struggle not to internalize that you're the problem versus no, you're actually calling out problems, and that's the way it works. It gets you to think you're the problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I've actually never.
Well, it sounds like your family kind of, my family was very authoritarian and traditional Southern family, right?
Right. Yeah. So I lucked out in that way. Yeah. To where, like I said, I mean, I would be doing this regardless of anything. And that's why the documentary people found very interesting, because it does become more difficult when you all of a sudden are connected with other people who are relying on you. And you're living in a system that has penalties for thinking and feeling in a truthful, anarchistic way. Right. If I was by myself, it would be a less interesting documentary. Yeah. But I may have a less, fulfilling life. I love having a family. I love having kids.
Well, and I think that's probably a source of sustenance in what you do too, right? Versus kind of being the lone the kind of tortured artist, right? That I grew up thinking about, that's what art and being an artist look like. You're miserable, quasi-suicidal, right?
Well, it's funny because I get that. I used to get that all the time, and I still get that, where people who they know my work, and they'll come to like a book reading or a gallery show or something, and they'll meet me and they'll talk to me for a few minutes, and they're just like, I have to say, you're not at all the person I expected to run into. I expected you to just be just like right at the edge of just ODing on, and just like feeling tortured. Yeah, but I mean, I generally, I've always been optimistic for no truly justifiable reason. I literally wake up every single day thrilled with what the day is going to do.
Yeah, well, which is interesting to me because some of the folks I think that have influenced you and influenced me, Vonnegut's work definitely, right? I would say the Beats, right? I think Hunter S. Thompson, and I always think of those as white American men who had their heart broken because the American myth, they discovered it was a lie.
Right.
And then so they medicate, self-destruct, or do the whole tortured thing.
Right.
Because much of what they had believed in, they discovered it wasn't the case.
Right. And they also, many of these people came from a certain privilege that was all of a sudden removed. And so what do
Yeah.
you do with that? You know, how do you
Yeah.
square that, you know?
Yeah. Especially if you're not reinforcing the narrative,
Right.
One last thing, like, so how are you, it sounds to me, are you in alliance with kind of Chris Hedges? Because I know that he's a big fan of yours and I'm a big fan of his work, but kind of his analysis of imperial decline. Do you think we're in the midst of that? And what would that mean for art, and what's the role of art if that's the case?
I do think I do agree with Chris on that observation, 100%. Where he and I are maybe a little bit different from each other is that I hold that there are variables in how human beings and societies can shift in unpredictable ways. And so that's sort of one of the things that not necessarily, I guess I could say that it gives me hope. But I wouldn't be surprised with whatever direction it goes in. Traditionally, when it comes to the artistic voice, it has always been there. Access to it has been sort of troubled in different times and in different societies, but people are always going to find a way to communicate what their emotional truth is. And to me, that to me should actually lead your comprehension that you use cognitively with your intellectual understanding of things. I always want to follow my heart first. And so I think that there's arguments that I've heard people make, and I agree with, that human beings en masse, if they are not destroyed by the technology, and and the short form justification for self-annihilation come true, will embody the change that is necessary. Because I do think the anarchist principles that we were talking about, they're still inside of us. There is a sense of panic in a human being who pauses and looks at environmental destruction and gets the stats on how close we are to not being able to turn things around, and there will be no further generations. It's up to the artistic voice and the sort of the poetic mind to communicate that on a humanitarian level and reawaken it. Because you're not teaching, you're not really giving information that people don't already have in their hearts. So it's about inspiring that kind of feeling to have people recognize that we're all vulnerable. And so that we all need the camaraderie of each other to say, or squeegee the third eye, as Bill Hicks would say, to recognize that it is just a ride, that we're living in this, we're contributing to either our destruction or our survival. And every cell in our physiology is begging for survival. So we have to learn how to listen to that and not be ashamed that that we are,
Sounds great. Well, is there anything you wanted to talk about or say before we conclude this? And thank you again so much for this time.
No, this has been great. It always buoys my spirit to sort of interact with somebody such as yourself, who is, thinking and feeling about the necessity for solutions. So I thank you for that. And if you do put in the Clown Crack website, there's a way to communicate with me. So I think that it's really important that we all find out that each other is out there and that we continue dialogues and start new conversations and build relationships, because that's what it's about. It's about the building of these personal relationships. And I look forward to new ones that may come out of this.
Sounds great. Well, I'm going to stop it and we can say our goodbyes, but thank you again. It's been great and everything I thought it was. And thanks for the work you're doing. I appreciate you making me uncomfortable. It keeps me honest, and it reveals to me the parts of me that I'm not paying enough attention to, probably. So it's incredibly helpful.
Thank you, and you're welcome.
Yeah.